many people have read the Rissho Ankoku and knows what it is? Have you read it? Oh, you have?
Yeah, a long time ago.
A long time ago.
And I read it.
Okay, so it is a very daunting. How many people have read the Lotus Sutra? No? Well, okay, it's also very daunting. So, Rissho Ankoku. No.
Is that the eye opening?
No, it's not. Actually, this is Nichiren's most kind of important work, but this is also one of the works that have caused or maybe made Nichiren Shonin infamous, because it is a work that we, especially looking at it at a Western point of view, we don't really have it, but it could be comparative to a lot of times, even though I don't like to use the association, but in the West we had, for instance, with Martin Luther, right, with the Great Reformation, in challenging the status of the religious leadership in the country based on their rituals, absolvements, etc. So he wrote and put I think he nailed it to the door with his shoe. Rissho Ankoku is actually a work by Nichiren Shonin, kind of, which you can see, as Sakamoto Sensei was saying, the different ages of Nichiren Shonin's life, right? We see a very young person going to study for a very long time. I think he said to about 32, developing his idea, developing his philosophy, developing his understanding of the teachings of Buddhism, and then trying it out, right? So you had the part of study, and then the second one was trying it out, propagation, right? Because then in the third part we see where he actually starts to write his letters in Sado, which you were talking about, Kanjin Honzon Sho, which are his main thesis on his belief and understanding after studying basic Buddhism, studying the different schools of Buddhism, then trying it out, propagating it, seeing how the world receives it, how other Buddhists received it, and then being able to understand and being able to write down his philosophy, which will have, Sakamoto Sensei will talk about Kanjin Honzon Sho, and many of his other works, Kaimok Sho, etc. They are showing his basic thesis on his practice of Buddhism. But Rissho Ankoku, it's interesting because basically, how many people think about submitting something to the government? Okay, so Nichiren Shonin, when he studied at Mount Hiei and all the other schools of Buddhism, he realized that in the three periods, as Sakamoto Sensei was saying, the true period, the imitative, and the declining period, most schools of Buddhism were trying to figure out when that exact period is, right? Because even now we're seeing that perhaps the Buddha was born much earlier. But there is a standard system that comes through Tiantai, as he was saying, which is measured in 1,000 years, okay? So here is the true Dharma, that's 1,000 years after the Buddha dies, or passes away, whenever that is, right? And then you have the imitative, where people imitate, like pretend Buddhism. So what that means is that externally they dress like a priest, right? They keep the precepts, they do everything they're supposed to do, the ritual, but inside they're empty. They really don't get the teachings, but they don't let on to the other people that they don't get the teaching. And then we have the declining Dharma, which he said is Mappo, right? Everyone's familiar with that term, Mappo, because Nichiren Shonin talks about it all the time. Declining, right? So this is declining latter age of the Dharma. What that means is that actually this is not 1,000 years. This continues until the process begins when a new Buddha comes to teach us, right? So in Japan, it's quite different than, well, I can speak for the United States, right? We have supposedly the separation of religion and state, supposedly. So therefore, we in the West are sometimes, we see what happens when religion rules a land, or religious influence from huge organizations. But in the East, they even took it deeper, saying that the basic philosophy of the teaching that's being propagated at that time has an immediate effect both on the people, on the environment and on the universe as a whole. So therefore, and before the advent of science, how do people explain things, right? A lot of times they would explain with a spiritual meaning. So now we understand why earthquakes and hurricanes and that happen. But a lot of people, well, I can say not even then, because in the United States we do have people that still use the same logic, saying, you know, all these diseases and stuff are happening because you're not following the right religion, right? So Nichiren Shonen's Rissho Ankoku was written on the 6th day of the 7th month of the first year of the Bunno period, which is 1260, okay? So this is going to be when he was 38 years old, okay? So 38 years old is they call the Kamakura period.
I think the other 10 works better.
Thank you. So we should remove. That's okay. No. This one looks better. Oh yeah, 38 years old. Okay, that's considered the Kamakura period. Okay. How many people? Has anyone here been to Kamakura?
Yeah.
Seen the Daibutsu, the large Buddha statue, right? What was the thing that basically you saw when you went into Kamakura? Right down the middle of the street. The Hachiman Shrine, right? I mean, it is big, and then also there's all these secret back roads. It's a really confusing layout because it's so old, right? So, and we know that during that place was full of all different styles of Buddhism, and there at that time was the seat of the de facto government. So that is where politics happened. So Nichiren Shonin during this time, during his youth, trying out his propagation, trying out his teaching, he went to especially Kamakura to present it so that it would reach the most influential people at that time. It would reach the government, and would reach other schools of Buddhism, and it would reach the common people as well. So 36 pages of the original manuscript are kept as a national treasure of Japan in what we call Nakayama Enkyoji Temple in the Chiba Prefecture. So these documents still exist. There are variations because Nichiren Shonin, I think it's 3 times he added and sent information in the form of the Rissho Ankoku with some additions based on the time and the teaching he would wish to present to the government. So that's the expanded edition, which was printed later. So it's very important to understand why Nichiren Shonin wrote this, because I'm going to talk about what it's about, because you may consider it pretty strange, because I mean it is the way that the literary device that it uses a conversation between a traveler and a master. This is not an uncommon way of transmitting information in the East. If you look at many Confucian texts, and that they also use the same idea, that there's a master and then there's a student. In this case it tends to be a traveler. But it's important to know that both the traveler and the master, their discourse is actually very important to telling the story, to explaining what the conclusion is that he wishes to reach, and also to give specific points of his teaching, right? Because as we look, even in the Lotus Sutra, they use parables and similes to be able to teach people, because straight commentary or dogma, as is presented, most people just don't get it. I mean, so I've read many of the sutras that had just long commentary without introducing any personal experience or any kind of story or narrative. Very complicated. So, but if you look at how the Buddha read, he often spoke in narrative with stories and parables, etc. The reason for writing this treatise was a series of strange things that were occurring in Japan. So as Komoto Sensei mentioned, pestilence. So we can't imagine, well, we might be able to imagine in some of the African countries during famine, when I was a kid, Ethiopia for instance, when people could no longer take care of the dead, right? Because people were still dying of malnutrition and disease, that even the even the ritual of being able to take care of the dead, like even during the Dark Ages, right? Here, or the plague in Europe, they didn't have time to do all of the typical ritual that we would associate with death, right? They just load them on carts and try to bury them. So in Japan, the same thing happened. Bodies would be strewn by the side of the road. And also, when we look at Japan, the feudalistic outline that it had, the large majority, were very poor. So their existence was teetering on death and sick, death and life was very small line. Most people didn't live very long. And also their lives were not valued because basically their lives was to kick up food and kick up labor to the higher percentage, right? Much as we use in the United States, they say the 1%ers, right? So in Japan it was very much that same system, but in feudalistic idea, the warriors, two big classes on top of the peasantry or the merchant class that basically lived off of them. So of course, as we know later, when it changed, that all collapsed. But why did he write it? So when we read it, Nichiren and Shonen said there were all these strange phenomena happening in the world, okay? Has anyone saw 7 Years of Tibet? Okay. Do you remember when the comet came? And they start banging pans and, trying to wish the comet away because the comet, was a change in the solar, map. So something was wrong. It usually meant something bad is coming. So they would try to kind of keep away the bad luck by making all this loud noise. Japan did many similar things to that. And so back then they had to decide, why are all these bad things happening? And humans still today still do that, right? I mean, if you've ever seen the 700 Club, I think Pat Robertson said that all of the disasters in that was because Florida and those people weren't really believing in Jesus enough that God finally decided to take his revenge out on them for not being dutiful children. So even today, as strange as it sounds, people still have this natural proclivity to, look for a spiritual meaning in something that even now, as we know, science can explain to us. So this writing was Nichiren Shonen's contemplation of why are all these terrible things happening? Why is the government maybe we have the same questions today, right? What's going on with the government? What's going on with the world? War is potentially always I'm waiting for the day that it just says that we've kicked it off with North Korea. It just could be at any moment, and we know that. The same kind of dread, but without the informational resources that we had. So just imagine things starting and wars starting without any kind of information, without any kind of warning. It must be paralyzing to people. So they look towards their spirituality for some comforts, for some defense, some protection. And this is for the purpose of rooting out those disasters. Nichiren Shonen searched the scriptures of Buddhism for the cause and means of eliminating them. So again, Nichiren's faith directed him into saying, even for the natural occurrences that are happening in the world, the war, the strife, the Buddha must offer some information, some teaching on it. His findings and conclusions, which were published earlier. Now, Rissho Ankoku is a pretty big document, okay? But as you know, has anyone ever written a thesis before or anything? Okay, so usually you use lots of other resources that you've already done, right? So Nichiren Shonen actually wrote two other ones. Treatise on Protecting the Nation, which was basically how to protect the nation, because another interesting thing, but not different than we have, the idea of God and country, right? There's a lot of studies that have gone on with the idea of mixing religion and country. So you have royal family right here. So do they descend from some deity of some sort? Like Japanese?
There is a complot guy who thinks that.
Okay, maybe. So, but in Japan particularly, as you can see, even Constantine, right? He joined Christianity to give his kind of path to world domination, justification through the eyes of religion and God, right? And now we know a lot more about that. But even in Japan, the royal family is seen as a direct ancestor of the gods of the land of Japan. So that's another interesting thing for modern people, because sometimes we say it's ridiculous, but there are still people that believe, and people who, how do you say, share those ideas to justify their own beliefs, right? Like, and I even say, look at it on a lower level, like the preachers on TV, right? You can't talk to God, but they can, right? So they have a direct line to the divine. And the second one was treatise on elimination of calamities. So how to eliminate all of the disasters that were happening in the world. And then they were put together in the treatise of spreading peace throughout the country by establishing the true Dharma. That's what the Rissho Ankoku means. So peace, how do we get peace? According to Buddhism, establishing the true teaching. And when I say true teaching, this is just not me saying the true teaching according to my opinion. As Tsukamoto Sensei is saying, the three periods of the Buddha, right? The true, the imitation, and the declining, right? Each one of these periods, as you saw the example of the time period, the 5 periods of his writings, each one of these teachings were set for a particular time. So a lot of priests during Nichiren's time would say, what is the appropriate one for now the declining age? And the declining age, some of the ideas of the declining age would be that Buddhism would almost become extinct. So it became extinct where? India, right? It's home, pretty much. And then also the corruption that happened in Buddhism. That people, that these monks were not practicing the true practice because that's 2,000 years after the Buddha. They were simply becoming politicians, right? And then here, the declining age means they had no, how do you say, respect whatsoever. So, and that actually Buddhism at some point would potentially, without the right teachings, disappear. So the true teaching, Nichiren Shonin, and actually he received, that's not his idea, it's from Master Tiantai, right? That the correct period for the declining age and the correct teaching is what? Lotus Sutra, right? Why? Because it's basically connecting all of these periods together to, and also making the teaching available to liberate all beings without exception. Where previous teachings, and also the idea of the declining age is that people would become more dull and their lives would be less. So supposedly, I guess back here people live longer, but maybe spiritually or longer, I guess. But here, that lifespan would decline, and that also intelligence would decline, and ability to practice spirituality. You know, in some ways, I think modern society, spirituality is changing, but to the old guard, it looks like it's absolutely declining, right? I mean, because I live in Seattle, which is one of the most godless states ever, because there are so many people, so many Christians tried to bring Christianity to Seattle, but it doesn't stick. And there's a strange phenomenon, and it grows because the whole West Coast is just a different mindset. I originally from the East Coast, which is extremely religious, right? And then you have the middle, Midwest and all that, very religious. South, religious. But the West Coast is this really interesting phenomenon that you just can't stick very well. There's less churches in Seattle than I've ever seen on my block in New York, right? Every block there's a church. So as he compiles all of this, he's trying to send to the government, be like me writing the president and saying, okay, in order to have peace, you must follow the teaching. And a lot of times, the government, as you have to think, which we don't have today, but they were the government.